Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our technical webinar. Our topic today is CloudFS Monitoring and Reporting. Now we're very excited to have Andrew Davis here to present. Andrew is Chief Technology Officer here at Panzura, and he'll be presenting today on the Panzura Statistics Collection System, as well as how to leverage it to observe and report key metrics across your cloud file system. Now, before we begin, I would like to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be muted on the call, so please enter any questions that you have in the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. I will take time to go through the questions at the end of the webinar, time permitting. All right, with that said, we are ready to get started. Andrew, I'll go ahead and hand things over to you.
Thank you, Nick. So today we're going to learn about the statistics collection system. We're going to talk about what we measure and why and how we prioritize that at Panzura. We'll talk about the main ways that we get access to that data on the filer. That includes the web UI dashboard and the alert system. That includes a programmatic interface via REST for integrating with your external applications. And that includes our SaaS offering and Freedom Pulse and how you would look at that in an aggregated view. And then finally, we'll wrap up talking about best practices and how to use these statistics. Now, the statistics collection system at Panzura is how we measure and manage our critical filer metrics. This includes how we collect it locally on each filer and store it locally in each filer. This also includes how we transport that onto the cluster master and the Freedom Pulse offering in order to look at the aggregated views. Now today, those statistics include both numerical time series data as well as string time series data that we use for managing alerts and events. This allows us to track and report on our KPIs that we've curated and found most valuable at Panzura within and how to manage our CloudFS. Now, this time series data is collected at each filer individually inside of a CloudFS. It allows us to both aggregate at a cluster master, but also look at individually on each filer local performance indicators. The SCS system allows us to slice and dice the data. It's got a great ETL system, which allows us to curate and show data in a way that aligns with our business needs for both predicting future uses as well as diagnosing current events. So SCS and why we use it at Panzura, it allows us to look at how a system is performing so we can make both diagnostic decisions and forward-looking capacity decisions on how we're going to deploy in the future. The main indicators of performance at Panzura, because it's as a service inside of an enterprise, is our network performance and our cache utilization. This talks about how we use and measure cache and network utilization to monitor and align with corporate goals around performance for end users. It also measures our cloud activity and around how we interact with cloud for both billing and for performance reasons. And of course, there are many more statistics which we'll go over throughout the presentation. Now, if the statistics that we have available allow you to see what's going on, you can also make configuration changes based on those statistics in order to change the interaction with the filer has with the other filers in the cluster, as well as your end users, so it better matches with how you want to use the filer and CloudFS in your organization. So each time series data inside of Panzura includes a set of self-contained information, which includes the metric itself and the description about it. It also includes the interval that we sample at, 1 second, 1 minute, 5 minutes. That's the raw data sampling rate. It includes the range of that data. Now, each filer typically keeps data locally for about 30 days. And if you want to have data longer, you'd have to look to something like Freedom Pulse or the REST API to pull it off into your own storage containers. Now, since each data series is individually kept, but can be aggregated at a site or a cluster master, we also have to keep the host that the data comes from, so we can always correlate back to the original source. Now, finally, each graph type, each data series has a graph type. Obviously, certain series have, they're more like counters, they're monotonically increasing. There are other graph types that are gauges, and a gauge type is going to be like a speedometer going up and down over time. And you're going to want to use those and map those into different ways and present those in different ways on the UI. So you'll need to know the graph type to do that. In addition to the raw statistic type, there's also graph types that allow you to aggregate, differentiate, or filter on events. And so for string events, you can both filter and you can look at edge triggered or individual events that are occurring right now versus historical, all available with our graph type option. Now, what does Panzura measure and why? We try to measure and focus on things that are relevant to the CloudFS infrastructure. Now, this includes the local host performance, of course, CPU, memory, and storage utilization. It also includes the network utilization. Now, this includes throughput, bandwidth, and latency, but because we have both client-side and cloud-side interfaces, we want to slice those to both LAN and WAN side and look at those critically in different directions. As a caching appliance, we focus a lot on our cache distribution, which includes the hot, warm, and cold local storage, as well as the cache effectiveness in the overall CloudFS. And finally, as a user interactive, right, we want to see and map to how users are interacting with the system, how many users are logged in, how many open files they have, their operations in read and write, and the latency of those operations in a system, so we can measure and see what's happening in the system and how it's affecting our users. Lastly, we have our license capacity, and this is all of our capacity measures around the local filer, the cloud, the managed capacity, and this helps you plan for future uses and where your growth might be. And there's many more statistics, but these are our curated statistics that we tend to focus on our default dashboards. So how do we access filer statistics today? We have a number of different options. They're generated on each filer today, but we also aggregate them on the master and via Freedom Pulse. Most customers and most Panzura employees will look at the master first as a primary interface into the entire CloudFS. Our metrics are reported and retrieved in a number of different ways. As we said, the main and most common way to look at them is via the web UI dashboard. Now, we have curated dashboards that are organized and presented in ways that Panzura has found to be most valuable, but there are also statistics that maybe are less valuable to the overall group, but might better align with your individual organization. So we've allowed and supported custom dashboards, so you can build up something that maps directly onto what you find most valuable. Now, in addition to the raw data series, we also have the Notification Center, and this is our interface to those events and alerts and the SCS system's collection of string-based time series data. Now, if the alerts on the web UI dashboard are not enough, you can also configure alerts in the configuration system and how you would get them outside of the box. And that includes via email, syslog, or SNMP traps, if that's the system that you're using. These are all the curated ways that we get data out of the system and within the dashboards. In addition to that, we also talk about the REST API and how you might integrate your own application, custom application, with Panzura's SCS system to get all of the information that we're going to show later on directly into your own application environment. And Freedom Pulse we'll talk about briefly, and that's an interesting product that looks at the overall view of not only one CloudFS, but multiple CloudFSs, and it gives a view into the role of those statistics, and we'll review that later on. So let's dive right into the dashboard view, our most common way to look at information that's curated in SCS. Now, we present this information in what we consider to be the most relevant time-wise, right, to the least in a curated world. These are all customizable, of course, and we'll go over each one individually. We've broken them down to 6 major categories and laid them out on the initial dashboard in importance for us. That includes primarily the network information. That's because the WAN interface is one of the less reliable interfaces or IT portions of the network. So we prioritize network at the top. We talk about network throughput and how we interact with the cloud. The next view is the sync state, and the sync state includes the overall view of the CloudFS and all the members in the CloudFS, which is why it's the second thing right there at the top. The next thing we talk about is our local resources and our local filer IO, including the disk configuration. We talk about the statistics around SMB users and their scale and performance. And then finally, our total capacities around metadata storage, which is a key performance indicator, our managed storage, and the overall cloud storage. And so let's look at those individually. So on the network charts, you're going to see not only your standard LAN WAN interface, but we've mapped those specifically onto the client to filer client interface, so you can see the experience that your individual clients are having when they connect to the filer. And we also have the cloud interface. This is your filer up, down, to and from cloud, which you also have bandwidth controls for. And so we allow you to kind of separate and see where you might have a problem on the cloud access or on the local side. Now, this graph is interesting because not only can you mouse over and see all of the individual points for any events that you want to see, but you can also support the pan and zoom interface at the bottom, where you can grab that bar, move it to the left or right, see any range of data, or grab the ends of that and zoom it in and out to see exactly maybe something happened 1 hour ago or last week on Tuesday. The pan and zoom allows you to see all of that. Now, if you're not looking for something specific in terms of bandwidth, right, but you do see that you had a cloud problem, the charts on the right will show you individual statistics around the cloud up-down load over time, and if there were any failures that occurred. If you happen to be running our cloud mirroring, we've taken that same chart and broke it up into individual clouds. Now, you're not going to see that on the network throughput because all cloud interfaces are aggregated, but on the right-hand side on those charts, you can see individually how each cloud in a cloud mirroring configuration is operating and whether you have any errors that are occurring on a specific cloud. The next thing we talk about after networking and cloud interfaces is our overall CloudFS synchronization and status. Now this starts out with the active filer status. The active filer status is only going to list the active filers. And if we look at the example here, we notice that it has the file system name for each file system in the CloudFS, the filer who's hosting that specific file system. And you notice here there's an asterisk. That asterisk represents the filer that you're currently logged in on. And so all of the perspective on this active filer status is from that host's perspective. It also has the operational status for each host in the CloudFS. And very important here, the snapshot sync status, that tells you whether you are in or out of sync with the other members in the CloudFS. So when I look at this, and most of our groups look at this, we look for the operational status and the snapshot sync status as the primary indicators on this chart for how the CloudFS on the whole is doing, as a fast look again right underneath the networking charts. Now, once you've looked at the overall active filers, you might want to look at the standby filers. For those of you that have deployed global HAs, this will be a full list of all the global HAs that are covering this filer that you've logged in on, and any of the local HA nodes that are covering the filer that you've logged in on. This won't have a list of all the local filers, but it will have a list of the local filers from this filer that you've logged in on's perspective. So it really ties into how this filer is covered in a disaster situation. So after our cluster look at what's going on, we look at the local disk usage and how that maps onto performance. And now our disk usage is mapped onto our pinned cache, of course, free space as an overall metric. The dirty cache, that's all of that data that users have written recently, but that have not yet made it to a cloud, right? Maybe you've got a slower WAN link and you're having some backup on data. That's the dirty cache representation, and it gives you an idea of how long it's going to take for other nodes in the CloudFS to see that data. The IRC, our intelligent reach cache, and that maps all of that data that's being pulled down from the cloud and given to the clients, and the performance the clients would experience. And finally, metadata, which is our overall representation of the CloudFS in the form of metadata capacity. And we can see that in the chart on the right, where we have the overall local disks broken out into those segments that we find most valuable and useful here. Now, after looking at the local disks from a capacity and use perspective, you can also look at the actual disk arrangement on the chart after that. And that includes all of the individual disks listed, their local capacity. If they're in a RAID group on hardware, you can see what RAID group they're in. But most importantly, you look at the total type capacity and you look at the status on the far right-hand side. Now, most disks, of course, are online, but if you had a disk that was resilvering, for instance, or offline, you would see it here reflected in the status. So those two columns, the capacity and the status, are the primary ones that we look at as indicators of both health and usage. So after storage, after local disk capacity, we typically look at the overall capacity in the system, and those are measured in several different ways. We have the metadata capacity, which is a key performance indicator, which has to sit in SSD, and it gives you an overall view of the size of your CloudFS because we do keep all metadata local. In addition to the actual metadata size, we're also showing right here at the bottom our optimization factor. Now, this is a combination of both the compression and the deduplication that your CloudFS is experiencing. You're typically paying in the cloud for whatever this optimization factor is your savings. So if you've written 100 terabytes, but your optimization factor is, in this case, almost 2x, you've actually only have 50 terabytes in cloud, and this Panzura deployment has saved you half of your cloud cost right up front before it even gets to cloud. Now, in addition to metadata as a primary indicator and a limiting factor, we also have our managed storage. This is our managed storage license, and it will indicate where you are in the overall license capacity that you purchased. And then we have cloud storage, and this represents and should reflect what you have available in this cloud bucket if you've isolated your cloud bucket to just Panzura. Otherwise, it certainly represents exactly what Panzura is using out of your cloud storage. Next, let's look at how the users interact with the system. And this is typically where you would go when you look at user diagnostic or when you look for scaling in the future. Now, we map users onto connected connections. And so we list the number of connected users directly. We look at the number of files that they have locked at any given time. We look at a couple of different ways for how users might connect. Sometimes you have SMB error connects in the launch process or shutdown process. Maybe a user just closes their laptops, but there's also other file system error disconnects that are more associated with environmental changes. And of course, the total disconnects, and these are actually healthy disconnects. We notice this box has no healthy disconnects. They're all typically as somebody's on a laptop and shut their machine down or closed it, and that's why you've got disconnects there. So in addition to SMB statistics on an individual point, right, we can also see those over time. And this is how you're going to map and predict what you're going to need in the future. Now we see currently active users, but you can also look at your active users over time because it has the same pan and zoom capability at the bottom. You can look at those on an individual day or across weeks or a month. This also maps those error disconnects, which most of the time you'll see line up with the end of day behaviors. You can see the latency that users are experiencing by looking at the metadata and data read latency. So you can map those onto problems that you might be having in the field on an individual site, and help you also predict as your user count went up, how did it affect your user latency or metadata read latency. All of these help you adjust for future deployments so you can understand the sizing that you might need in a new environment. So after all of the protocol and file specific things, we talk about system resources. And system resources are typically measured in our CPU load average and memory usage. And this gives you a feel for, is your local filer at a certain site acting in a way that we typically recommend, which is kind of under 50% utilization in order for you to soak up those momentary bursts. And so you can see that with your CPU load average over time. Memory usage is kind of interesting because as a caching device, you really want to have high memory usage. You want to cache as much as you can in RAM. You want to cache as much as you can in disk. If you have unused RAM or unused disk in a caching appliance, you're probably not getting the best performance you could get. So in this case, you want to look for numbers in the 70 or 80% cache utilization or memory utilization in these environments. Now, this is all of the curated data that Panzura has. And this is the data that we place on our default dashboards as a kind of roll up and things we find most useful. But if you're looking for statistics that maybe we haven't curated yet, we have customized dashboards. Now, customized dashboards you can find on the lower right-hand side of the dashboard. There's a dashboard explorer. And when you select that, you get a list of all of the current dashboards. There's the active dashboard you can see right now. And there's a list of default dashboards that Panzura has provided. Now, in this case, you'll notice there are no user-defined dashboards. If you want to create a user-defined dashboard, you come to the Dashboard Explorer, you select the encircled plus at the bottom, and you're presented with this pop-up. And this pop-up allows you to define the new dashboard that you're going to create. You can give it a name to represent specifically something that you're looking at, like working cache here, and a small summary for what it is that you want to explore and look at. Now, once you save that, what you're presented with is typically a blank page. Now you're looking at your dashboard, but it has no dashlets yet. So back down the right-hand side, you select dashlet to add a dashlet, and now you're presented with another pop-up so you can explore all the data available to you. Now we start out by selecting the host. Now on that cluster master, you're going to have a full list of all the hosts in the CloudFS. But if you're on a specific filer and you're just looking at that filer, you're only going to see that filer's name as a selectable item for any of these reports. Once you've selected that host, you can then move on to selecting the statistic type. Now, even though I say that we've moved beyond the curated reports, we still have a number of reports that maybe we don't show on our default dashboard, but they're already curated and ready to go. So we'll look at some of those curated reports here. If you select report and hit apply, now you'll see the selected reports. And these are the names of the selected reports that we've already curated, but don't show on our default dashboard. In this case, I'd really like to look at our cache distribution and effectiveness. So I'm going to select both of those and put them on and apply it, and then look at the dashboard. And here's what you'll see on this new dashboard. For the cache distribution, that shows the hot, warm, and cold state of the local IRC cache. And you can see in this particular case, the blue line was our hot cache, and over time that decreased. And of course, as that data moved from hot to warm, the amount of warm in that green line increased, something very predictable. Should you have over time a lot of cold cache sitting there and then something happens and you see a big burst of hot cache that pushes out cold cache, you might expect that somebody has uploaded new content or had a massive read and it's going to affect other users in the system. So this is a great statistic to look at when you see user behavior or user performance impact. The graph on the right looks at the same information around cache, but now it looks at it from a hit and miss perspective rather than a hot, warm, cold perspective. And you'll notice there at the beginning of time, all of those misses that happen early. And then of course, things clean up in the latter half, which is why you see on the chart on the right, where it's fairly smooth and everything is moved from hot to warm. So this is how you would add customized dashboards and dashlets into that. So you can map these directly onto what you're going to use and focus on in your environment for performance. Now, after you're looking at all those data time series around numeric numbers and KPIs, let's go look at some of those string series around events and alerts that happen within a Panzura filer or in aggregate inside of CloudFS. If you go on the right-hand side on the primary login, there's a notification center, and you click on that, here's what comes up. Now this shows all the alerts in the current system organized with the severity level on the left-hand side, the name of the alert, and the time that it occurred. Now you can filter these. On the top right there, there's a search option. That search option allows you to select maybe a subset of alerts by keywords in them. You can also select within the last 30 days. You can select by severity level, or you'll notice here we don't have the file that it came from because most of these would be local. But if you were on the master filer, you might have many alerts, and you might want to select which filer or controller you want to look at. So let's select one of these individually and see what it shows. For an individual alert detail, you can see the alert, the severity. Here's where you can see the source of where this specific alert came from originally, that same message about what it is and what it means, and then the time frame for exactly when it happened. So this allows you to drill down and see more information about an individual alert, all from that notification center. Now, if the alerts are not what you're looking for, right, we also have the running processes on that same screen. So on the far left-hand side at the top, you can move down to running processes. These are processes that you've kicked off and started, like an AD join, and you can see whether they were successful or not. But it also includes things like packet captures. Whenever you've run a diagnostic tool, you get a process, a marker here that you can go back and look and see what's been run and what the status of those things are. Each one of these you can also select, and it shows you a detailed view. For instance, in this case, the diagnostic tools were run, and here's the time, the start and end time of that run. And so you can go back and look at what might have occurred, of course, over time. You can also just trash all these over time, so you don't have to continue to look at what's going on. You can look at only the most relevant information and recent information. Now, after looking at all these events and curated stuff, you're still on the dashboard. And so in many cases, customers want to look at and experience their alerts outside of the Panzura environment. And so let's talk about how you would configure alerts to be exported from Panzura. Now, if you go to the configuration section of the web UI, there's a monitoring section, 3 tabs down, which includes 6 different ways to look at and view your alerts in the system. And we're going to go through 3 of these right now. We're going to start off by looking at the filer syslog. So if you are a Splunk house and you use Splunk for visibility into what's going on, right, you might want to configure syslog to see all those alerts and events. Here's where you would configure your syslog server, and down below all of the individual alerts and which ones you might want to see on the in syslog. Now, if syslog is not your choice, maybe you'd rather get it via email, you can go into the email configuration, select or configure your SMTPC server, select who the email is to come from when the filer sends out the email. We support both encryption and authentication. If we were to select that here, we would get additional requirements to fill in around authentication. I highly recommend you always test this before you move on. So you can put in your own email address there at the bottom and do a test. Look for that email to show up so you can verify that the email settings are correct. Now, if you already have a management station for SNMP, we have an SNMP alert system. Now, this isn't the SNMP in general for statistics. This is specifically around alerting. And alerting, the SNMP system has to reach out to your management station. And so you have to configure your management station here, or stations if you have more than one, and the community strings associated with them. Now, once you've made that connection, you can also select which specific events you want to see via SNMP. And there's a long list of events here. And in some cases, we have thresholds that you can set in order to be able to see specific events. So these are all ways that you're going to get your alerts out of Panzura and integrate with the environment that you already have, whether that's syslog, email, or SNMP. So if all of these curated methods don't map onto how you want to use the Panzura statistics and how you want to interact with them, right? We have a REST API. Now, for those of you that haven't used Swagger in a while or ever, it's a real treat, right? The REST APIs today are so prevalent that there is I would say almost a de facto standard in Swagger. Swagger is a documentation system, an active documentation system for interacting with APIs. Now, Panzura uses this internally, so you can log into any filer and type API docs at the end of the URL, and you'll get our Swagger interface. So there are, I think, 300, 400 separate endpoints for Swagger. And today we're just going to focus on the SCS statistics and the interface in Swagger for those. There are 4 main areas for SCS REST API. The first 2 are around listing. And so if you access them via the list, you'll see the full list of data statistics or the full list of reports. Once you've selected something from one of those lists, you can dive into that specific metric with the data metric or data or report name, And those are all of our time series numeric data. And then if you want to look at the string data for the alerts and events for all the things we showed previously, there is an event API via REST that you can grab all of the events and some controls we'll go over in a moment. Our entire file browser inside of the web UI is built on this SCS interface for file interaction. And from here, you can walk the entire file system and grab statistics about individual files. And finally, the last thing is you can look at the overall cluster status using this get filer availability below. And we'll go into each one of these individually briefly. But in sum total, these are all the methods we use specifically for the SCS interface. Now let's look at the data list capabilities. So this is the great thing about Swagger. Not only do you see and have documentation around the different APIs, you can actually interact with the APIs directly. So here we have data lists and report lists. And if you just select the application and try it out, you'll actually see an actual API call that will respond with the data that an application would see. And here, in this case, here's our report list and all the reports that we have already curated in the system. You would see the same thing for data, but the data list is several hundred statistics. It's fun to go through, but it's a lot of information. Now, based on that, we're going to look at one specific one. Now, the metrics, if we're going to dive in and look for a specific data metric, there's a lot of controls for how we want to see that. So the first thing you're looking at is the metric name. And the metric name is what you just retrieved from your list, from your data listing at the top. Now, with that list, you might have on the master cluster filer, you're going to have different cluster endpoints, different host names. So you have to select the host name. If you left star in there, it would be all hosts. The interval, again, is not selecting when the number of samples were taken, but in this case, how you want to see it. So for instance, maybe you want to see hourly statistics or daily statistics. This is where you set up that interval for the number of seconds in an hour or number of seconds in a day. The G type we talked about, or graph type, you would say this is a counter or this is a gauge. There's also controls for changing a counter into a gauge with differentials. You can also aggregate. So if you did select star for the host on a CloudFS master, and there might be 50 hosts there, if you did an aggregation, you would see all of those hosts add up. So this is how you would, for instance, look at how many users do I have in total on my entire CloudFS. You would select star for host, you would select gauge, and then you would select a capital A for aggregate. And you would aggregate all of the users' accounts across all of the hosts in a cluster. Next up, we have range. Now, range is UNIX timestamps, and so they include 0, which is the dawn of time in 1970, and -1, which means right now. So it's a relative number that means right now in current time. The negative numbers really always represent a relative time. So the left hand before the comma is the start time, and the right hand after the comma is the end time. So say you only wanted to see the last hour's worth of data, you could put -3600 and you would get the last hour's worth of data only. So the relative negative usages can be very valuable for having a generic interface that says, get me the last hour's worth of data without having to know which hour you're in. And finally, if you're getting too many points, you're getting millions of points back from a dense series, you might want to instead say, I don't really know the time zone, but I only want to select the last 50 points or the first 50 points. And so the ability to control points at the bottom is a very valuable feature when you're getting overwhelmed with data and you don't want to control just the time range. Let's go through a specific example here. In this case, we're going to look at our total cloud egress. So we selected the WAN Cloud CSP Amazon out octets, and we do that by looking at the data list we saw before, and that will give us something specific that we start with and something specific we can map here. We select the local host that we want to see. In this case, this is on the local host and not on the master. We select the time interval, so the last 3 hours, or looking at samples every 3 hours. That's about 10,000 seconds. We know that this is a counter, so we're going to select counter because it's an octet, which is always monotonically increasing. Now for the time range, we're going to look at from now to the previous 5 days. Now 5 days is about 551,000 seconds if you didn't know. And this is going to give us now the last 5 days of data aggregated every 3 hours in a graph. The number of return points, we're going to leave blank at this time. It'll be auto-calculated because we already aggregated up to the 3-hour interval. Now, when we do that, here's what the API returns for us. Here's what a raw time series looks like in SCS. It has the title of the time series. We have our own timestamp. Now, Unix epoch seconds only refer to seconds, and we wanted more granularity. So this has the seconds before the decimal down to the microseconds after the decimal. So that's what the type's time val represents, and you'll see that through all the statistics. And so for each statistics, you have both a timestamp and a value, and the value represents the metric that you're looking at. So if you were to take that and massage the data and put it into Excel and graph it, here's what you would have gotten. So this allows you to bring that data into whatever environment that you want to bring it into and graph in whatever environment or act on the data in whatever environment that you have by really controlling what it is you can see. So let's look at one of the reports. Now, again, these are all of our curated information that sometimes made the dashboard, sometimes did not, but they're still all very valuable curated information. Now, from that report list, we got a set of reports. In this case, cloud activity is the one we're looking at. We've still selected that same filer in that same 3-hour interval and that same 5-day range. Now, what's interesting about reports is they're not just a single data series. A report might have 3, 4, 5, or if you're looking at I/O, you might have selected, instead of aggregating, you might have selected all drives and you would get 30 different drive informations back. So each report might have many, many data series in it, and you'll have to expect that when you're looking at the output. In this particular case, for the cloud metrics, what we're seeing is the cloud service provider uploads, cloud service provider downloads, and any errors that occurred as 3 separate time series so that when you graph them, you can see, for instance, when errors occurred, how they might have influenced your cloud uploads or downloads. Now, after your data, your numerical time series, you have access to all of those events and the strings. Now, the interface for that is a little bit different, even though you still have the host, and that's important because on the master, you could see events for all the hosts. It also has the range operator we saw before. Now, here's where G-type is a little bit different because not only is this an event, and that's the lowercase e, but you can actually change events into edge triggers. So rather than seeing the event occur continuously, you can say, hey, only show me when the event first started occurring or when the event went back down, which is when the event went away. And that would be prefaced with clear. You can also use the capital N, which means now, like show me all active events right now, as opposed to historical events. So you have some great controls for looking at events that can help you interact with the system in a real-time basis. And then finally, if you're only looking for a specific event or event type, you can use the filter there. And just like you would use the search bar on the notification center, you can set the filter for whatever you're looking for in your event stream. And here's the result of that search that we had above. It looks like the same format. The events themselves have a little different format because they're string forms. They still have the time value, but now they also have the spec, which is a specification for the specific event and what occurred, the severity of this on a scale of 1 to 10, and the original source. So if you were to aggregate events, you might have received events from all of the hosts, and this would show each individual host and where it came from as one data series. So after our statistics and our string-based information, let's look at the file browser. File browser has, again, its own interface via Swagger, and you can interact with that directly on Swagger. So there are a suite of information that we have in the file system, everything from cache statistics to the stat information you would get about file ownership and file size, to GRW, like which member of the CloudFS owns a specific file or directory. All of those are individual pieces of information that you can see, or you can select all, which would show all that information within one single query. Now, for the file browser and the file interface, the info you put at the top is your all or some specific nature. But what you use the filter for is the actual path in the file system that you want to query. And so this allows you to fully walk the file system, both on a file and directory basis. You put the path in there, and what you get back is for a specific path. In this case, we were looking star, which was a directory structure. We're going to get an entry for each file in that directory, which includes the name of the file, the stat of the file, which includes the size of it, access time, C time, and M time. The AV state, which includes, in this case, it includes a clean file that's been modified and has no scan types. I'm assuming AV scan is not running on this particular file. The sync state, if this was interacted with other filers. The cache state, you'll notice in this case, it's a total of 6 blocks, and all 6 of them are cached. So you can tell whether the user's going to have a great experience or not when they initially access this file, or whether it has to be pulled down from the cloud. You can also see the policy information, which includes what the state of this particular file is. Is it cached? Is it pinned? Is it pre-pop? Things like that. It's a very rich set of information, specifically around things that Panzura finds to be very useful and the value of Panzura in its cloud and caching nature. Okay. After the file browser interface, you have the overall view to the entire CloudFS. Now, this particular interface doesn't have any options. You just have a straight REST interface, and when you select it, what you get is a full list of primary values and statistics, primary values and configuration for each individual filer in a CloudFS. Now, this will show, and what we use it most for, is showing the sync state for different filers. And so you would see the last snapshot that it has sent to the cloud, the current snapshot that it's on. Any dirty cache would be represented by that difference. So we use this for both identifying filers and to find out what they look like in terms of sync state. It's a very valuable tool for looking at it and exporting it to an external application. So once you've gone over your dashboard and looked at the curated information or the REST API and looking to integrate it with your individual local on-prem applications, we also have Freedom Pulse. Now, Freedom Pulse is our aggregated view of an entire CloudFS. So Freedom Pulse is available via our Vision interface. And so you get a Vision account and log in, and you can see on the bottom left-hand side, there's Freedom Pulse. When you select Freedom Pulse, you're presented with a CloudFS listing, and this is a listing by master for each CloudFS. So you select the one that you're most interested in, and once selected, you'll get some charts. Now, what's interesting about Freedom Pulse is that because it looks in aggregate, it has some interesting information that you don't see on the master nor the filer itself, and that's about aggregation. So you see the same CPU utilization and the same memory utilization you might have seen for an individual filer, but now you see it across all the filers in your CloudFS. This is a primary value for Freedom Pulse, that aggregated view. So in addition to the core facilities like memory and CPU, right, you can also look at networking. You'll notice here that still those daily spikes that are happening, but now you're seeing it across all the Cloud File System members in the cluster. This is also how you would see the aggregated count of SMB users, right? If you didn't generate your own custom dashboard, you could look at it here and see all of the users and where they are and which file they're logging into. And of course, the local disk I/O reads and writes can represent it across all the disks in a CloudFS for a specific filer or all the disks individually. Now, this is all the data time series for numerical data, right? We also have events available on Freedom Pulse. Now, these events have their own values for being aggregated. So for instance, where you saw just the list of events on the filers themselves, in Freedom Pulse, you're getting aggregated. So you can see events over time, which is a very valuable view to activity or potential problems. Right? Not only are they just straight events, but you can also look at events by level or even events by filers for looking for filers that might have a higher event rate, even event by category if you're looking for high severity events. And of course, you still have the same interface that you would have on a filer where you can see all the individual events, where they're coming from on the filer list, and then the event message for each one. So you can still see all the event data, but you also get all the aggregated views inside of Freedom Pulse. It's a great aggregated view. If you're interested, I'm sure we can get you signed up and you can configure your filers to talk to Freedom Pulse and see this aggregated view. So finally, let's talk about best practices. We've gone over how you're going to monitor the system either on the dashboards or REST API so you can pull out the data yourself, right? The whole goal is to look at the trends, where the data is telling you you're going to be going or you are already going, the number of users increases or capacity increases so you can plan for your future usage. It also helps you identify pain points that are occurring now or might be occurring in the near future. We focus this on our network charts and our core resources in CPU or sync state, or for future look at capacity monitoring for both the cloud object store as well as managed capacity and local metadata capacity. The goal here is to show you both the information we've curated, but also show you how to access and build your own custom dashboards via that web UI to be able to see individual statistics and the aggregation of those statistics, both at the master as well as Freedom Pulse. Please register, it's a great interface. For the outside of the monitoring, if you're looking for something specific or you're having, you want to look for a specific alert or event, we talked about how you can go to the notification center and see and keep tabs on all the events that are occurring. But also if you want to export those events into your own internal orchestration system, syslog, email, or SNMP traps, how you would configure those to interact with the Panzura system and get those events out of your environment. So after monitoring alerts, right, we talked about the REST API. Now this is really an API that allows you to integrate the raw data with whatever application you're using, or how you might integrate our information on the filer with your own business process management tools or orchestration tools for VMs, or even build back on reporting. So with these interfaces, we've given you the option of looking at curated content, interacting with the REST API to build your own organizational view, all based on the SCS statistics system. I think going forward, it would be great to hear from you about how you're using SCS via the REST API would be great, or how you're learning about how SCS helps you manage and understand how your system is functioning. I look forward to hearing from you on that. So that ends our presentation today. Nick?
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. We now have time for a few questions that came in during the presentation. The first question is, so there is a lot of aggregated information on aggregated storage usage and kind of total SMB statistics. The first question is there a way to kind of measure the attributes of like an individual SMB share, either the data usage of that share, I guess the size of it, or those connected to it?
So today, the information for SMB users, for instance, and SMB capacity is on the whole, right? We do have plans for per share usage that's coming down, but that really is going to depend on, shares are complex because you can have shares that map onto the same content across the CloudFS, but there is a plan for doing that. Today, it's not available.
All right. Next couple questions are relevant to the API, and then one of those is there a way to connect to the API without full admin access? So I think they're looking for something that can, just see SCS, for example, or statistics, but not manage everything about the filer.
Yeah, so there are, two interfaces. There are two accounts. There's an admin account, and there's also a read-only account on the filer. The read-only account would be able to read some of the statistics. It would not be able to interact with things like the file browser, which would require more administrative privileges, but otherwise statistics would be available with the read-only account.
Excellent. And I believe you can set, I know, the password of the read-only account from the maintenance page of the filer, if you want to look into that. And then kind of a third API related question, I guess, sort of relevant to SCS in general as well, is is there a way to see individual metrics documented with units? I know one had to do with, okay, if a storage SCS statistic returns a value of like gigabytes rather than bytes.
I'm sorry, are you trying to ask for it in a different form? I missed that.
I think the question is knowing the unit of what an SCS stat returns.
Oh, I see. So most of the statistic names have a unit in them, like you saw for the WAN out octets, right? That has a specific unit in it. Disconnects or number of users or number of connections. The units are typically in the name itself, like connections. If there are cases where that isn't true, right, we should adapt and fix that because that would be considered a problem. All the units are really in the name.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I think that's all the questions that came in today. Thank you everyone for attending today's technical webinar. Thank you especially, Andrew, for presenting and taking the time to go through this material. Now, this webinar has been recorded, so keep an eye out for the link to the recording. We'll email that recording link out to everyone over the next few days. But with that said, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Happy holidays, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.